The year of sundered webs, -339 in the Daily Reckoning, the last day of Netheril. It began in the pre-dawn darkness, in the casting chamber at the heart of the enclave of Ileana, where Karsus stood surrounded by the accumulated components of 12 years of preparation. The chamber was vast. It needed to be, for the magical energies that would be channeled through it were of a magnitude that no enclosed space had ever been asked to contain. Runes of power had been inscribed on every surface, floor, walls, ceiling, each one a critical element of the spell's architecture, each one the product of months of painstaking calculation and enchantment. The material components were arranged in concentric circles around the central casting point, each one precisely positioned according to formulae so complex that a single misplacement of a fraction of an inch would have been fatal. Karsus began to cast. The spell was Karsus's avatar, the only 12th level spell ever created, the culmination of the greatest magical civilization in the history of Netheril, the single most ambitious act of spellcraft ever attempted by a mortal being. It would take 6 hours to complete. 6 hours of continuous, unbroken concentration, during which Karsus would need to simultaneously manage thousands of interlocking magical processes, each one feeding into the others in a cascade of escalating complexity. His mind, the most formidable mind in the Empire, would be stretched to its absolute limit and beyond. And the target of all this effort, the entity whose divine power the spell was designed to steal, was Netheril, the mother of all magic, the keeper of the weave, the goddess who held reality together. For the first hour, the casting proceeded without incident. The magical energies gathered slowly, like water pooling behind a dam, building in pressure and intensity with each syllable Karsus spoke. The runes on the chamber walls began to glow, faintly at first, then with increasing brightness, as the power flowing through them intensified. Outside Ileana, the sky darkened, not with clouds, but with the displacement of ambient magical energy, as the weave itself bent and distorted around the focal point of the casting. By the second hour, the other enclaves could feel it. Across the sky above Netheril, arcanists on dozens of flying cities paused in their work and looked up, sensing a disturbance in the weave that was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was not a disruption, not yet. It was more like a tension, a tightening, as though the fabric of magic were being pulled toward a single point with increasing force. The mythallas hummed at a slightly different pitch. Quasi-magical items flickered and stuttered. The arcanists exchanged uneasy glances and wondered what was happening on Ileana. By the third hour, the Farim knew. Deep beneath the surface, in their tunnels and caverns, the cone-shaped horrors felt the weave convulse and recognized, with their alien intelligence, that something unprecedented was occurring. They did not know what Karsus was attempting. They did not need to know. They understood only that the magical fabric of reality was being subjected to stresses that it had never been designed to bear, and that whatever was causing those stresses was potentially more dangerous than anything they themselves had ever done. By the fourth hour, the gods knew. On their various planes of existence, the deities of the Faerunian pantheon felt the tremor in the divine substrate, the deep structural layer of reality that connected the mortal world to the divine. Something was reaching up from the mortal plane, grasping at the foundations of godhood itself. Netheril, the goddess of magic, felt it most acutely. She felt the spell closing around her like a fist, reaching for the essence of her divinity, attempting to pry it loose from her being and transfer it to a mortal vessel. By the fifth hour, the weave was screaming. There is no other word for it. The fabric of magic that covered the world like an invisible ocean was being distorted, compressed, and torn by forces that exceeded anything it had ever experienced. Wild magic surges erupted across Faerun. In distant Kalimshan, a merchant's minor illusion spell exploded into a conflagration that leveled a city block. In the forests of Kormanthur, the trees themselves began to glow with uncontrolled magical energy. In the Underdark, entire cavern systems collapsed as the magical forces that had stabilized the rock for millennia suddenly fluctuated and failed. The world was coming apart at the seams. And then the sixth hour ended. The spell completed, and for one terrible, glorious, impossible moment, it worked. Karsus ascended. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, the full divine power of Netheril, goddess of magic, keeper of the weave, the most fundamental deity in the Faerunian pantheon, was ripped from her being and poured into the mortal body of a human arcanist. For one instant, Karsus held the power of a god. He could feel everything, every spell being cast on Netheril, every magical item, every enchantment, every cantrip whispered by a child in a distant village, every mythala humming in every flying city, every thread of the weave, from the mightiest wards of the elven high mages to the faintest traces of ambient magic in the soil and the stone and the air. It was all his, all of it. The totality of magic on Netheril was flowing through him, and for one brief incandescent moment, he understood everything. He understood the weave. He understood the Faerim. He understood the cure for every ill that had ever plagued his beloved empire. And then he understood his mistake. The power of Netheril was not merely the power to cast spells or create enchantments. It was the power and the responsibility to regulate the flow of magic to and from every being, every item and every location on Netheril. It was the power to maintain the balance of the weave, constantly adjusting, constantly compensating, constantly preventing the accumulation of magical energy in one place from draining it from another. It was a task of infinite complexity, requiring infinite attention, and it had to be performed every second of every day without interruption or error. Because if it stopped, if, even for a moment, the regulation of the weave ceased, the entire system would collapse. Karsus could not do it. He was the most powerful mortal spellcaster in history. His mind was the most formidable instrument of magical comprehension that humanity had ever produced. And it was not enough. Not remotely enough. The task of maintaining the weave required not merely intelligence, but a kind of omniscience, the ability to perceive and respond to billions of simultaneous events across the entire world. Netheril had been born to this task. She had been shaped for it by the very forces that had created the universe. Karsus was a mortal man who had been shaped by nothing more than human ambition and human genius. And the gap between what he was and what the role demanded was not a gap at all. It was an abyss. The weave surged, it fluctuated, it buckled. In the space of seconds, the magical fabric that held reality together began to tear. Spells failed across the world, enchantments collapsed, magical items went dark, and in the sky above Netheril, the mythalars, those miraculous devices that drew their power from the weave to keep the flying cities aloft, began to flicker and die. Netheril acted. With her last remaining shred of power, the tiny fragment of divinity that Karsus's spell had not yet fully consumed, the goddess of magic made a choice. She could have fought Karsus for control. She could have tried to wrest her power back. But there was no time. The weave was unraveling faster than even a goddess could repair it, and if it collapsed completely, the consequences would be beyond catastrophic. Magic would cease to exist. Not just on Netheril, but everywhere. The planes themselves would begin to dissolve. Reality, in the most literal and absolute sense of the word, would end. So Netheril sacrificed herself. She died. Deliberately. Consciously. She severed her own connection to the weave, using the energy released by her death to block Karsus's access to her power. It was, in effect, the most powerful dispel magic ever cast, a divine counterspell powered by the death of a god. The link between Karsus and the weave shattered. The stolen power was cut off, and for a span of time that might have been seconds or might have been minutes. The accounts vary, and in the chaos of those moments, precision was impossible. All magic on Netheril ceased to function. All magic, every spell, every enchantment, every magical item, every ward, every barrier, every protection, every mythala. The flying cities of Netheril had no wings. They had no engines. They had no physical means of staying aloft. They existed in the sky for one reason and one reason only. The mythalas drew upon the weave to generate the magical force that held them there. And when the weave died, even for a few seconds, the mythalas died with it. The cities fell. Imagine it. Dozens of flying enclaves, inverted mountaintops, each one home to thousands of people, each one a self-contained world of impossible architecture and magical wonder, suddenly, simultaneously, with no warning, losing the only thing that kept them in the sky. Imagine the first lurch, the sickening drop, the instant of disbelief as the citizens of High Netheril realized that the ground, miles below, impossibly far below, was rushing up to meet them. Imagine the screaming, imagine the arcanists frantically attempting to cast spells that no longer worked, grasping for the weave and finding nothing, reaching for the power that had sustained them all their lives and touching only emptiness. They fell. All of them, every flying city in the empire, crashing to the earth with the force of mountains dropped from the sky. The impact of each one was like a natural disaster, a localized apocalypse of shattered stone and crushed buildings and ruined lives. The landscape of northern Faerun was forever scarred by their impact craters, and the ruins of the enclaves, broken, scattered, half buried in the earth, would dot the region for millennia afterward, silent monuments to the greatest catastrophe in the history of the world. And Karsus watched, as the stolen power was ripped from him, as the divine knowledge that had filled his mind for one incandescent moment drained away like water from a shattered cup. Karsus felt the full weight of what he had done crash down upon him. He saw the cities falling. He saw his people dying. He saw the world he had loved, the civilization he had given everything to save, being destroyed, annihilated, erased from the sky by the consequences of his own actions. His body began to change. The backlash of the failed spell, combined with the severing of the divine link, triggered a transformation that no magical theory could explain. Karsus's flesh hardened, his skin turned the color of rust, his limbs locked in place. He was turning to stone, petrifying from the inside out, frozen in the moment of his greatest horror. The last thing Karsus saw with eyes that were already becoming stone was his entire civilization being destroyed because of him. His petrified body, swollen, distorted, barely recognizable as human, fell from Eilenar as the enclave disintegrated around it. It plummeted through miles of empty air and struck the earth in a part of the high forest that would come to be called the Dire Wood. The impact drove his stone form deep into the ground, and over the centuries that followed, the earth rose around it until the petrified remains of Karsus resembled a natural geological formation. A massive butte of red-brown stone, vaguely human in shape if you squinted and knew what you were looking for. The city of Karsi was eventually built around its base by people who had no idea that they were living in the shadow of the man who had killed the world. Karsus was never accepted as a petitioner by any god. His soul was not claimed by any plane. He simply ceased to exist as a conscious being. Trapped in stone, his awareness, if any remained, forever frozen in the moment of his greatest failure. Some sages believe he is still in there, still watching, still seeing the cities fall, an eternity of horror compressed into a single endless instant. This was Karsus's folly. This was the day the sky fell, and this was the end of the greatest civilization that humanity had ever built, not through invasion, not through plague, not through the slow decay of centuries, but through a single act of magnificent suicidal hubris. The elves had called him the child who would become a god. They were right. For one moment, he was a god, and in that moment he learned what the gods had always known, and what the Netheris, for all their brilliance, had never understood. Some powers are not meant for mortal hands, and some heights once reached can only be descended by falling.